I'm going to try and recapture what I said at the ISSS conference in this YouTube recording. The title of the paper is Dancing with Ambiguity, and I have to thank Donella Meadows for the notion of dancing from her paper of Dancing with Systems. And I have to thank Michael Lissack for bringing up the idea of ambiguity for this conference. I have to also point out that most of the ideas that I talk with are central to the work of Umberto Maturana. And further, I would like to thank Ranulph Glanville for his recommendation to keep my presentations much simpler and shorter than I have been used to, and I'm afraid I have not been able to fully follow his advice, but in his memory, I would like to thank him anyway. And I also would like to thank Arche Hulstein for reviewing the original Berlin presentation several times with me while I was in England. And there are many, many other people I would like to thank, but I cannot name them all here. So on with ideas. You all know the story of the proverbial elephant. The story is usually told with the idea that if you look at one part or another, you get a partial picture. There's the pillars, there's the snake, there's all the different parts. And so the idea is that if we could take all these different views that people have and different groups of people have, put them all together, we could get the picture of the full view. So we need a process for creating that full view. And indeed, many processes have been developed, and people do get together and say, yes, it is indeed long and skinny. That would be the tail and the trunk people. And maybe it's pillar-like. We just have to adjust our view a little. But then there's the faction who says, no, it's nothing like that. It's just a solid wall. So we end up kind of more in the process dividing views than you create an overview picture. So what's wrong with this approach? What's wrong with this notion? So I ask, where is this elephant anyway that we're trying to define from these different perspectives? How do we even know there is an elephant? And is there even an elephant? Or is that just something that we invent in our imagination? To come to that, I have to ask about what are we doing? Are we really making operations of discovery on an approach to an ultimate truth? Is this the ultimate truth of an elephant? This implies that we are looking for reality. We're looking for what really is there. And there are different versions of this. And when we have a particular version, we will consider any other experience as, it's just subjective. It's not objective. You're mistaken or you're wrong. And we feel very strongly about this to the extent that we'll argue or even go to war about these. So I'm going to go back to one of the statements that Maturana has made, and I find really fundamental. He asks, instead of what is, how do I do what I do as I operate as an observer? And to answer these in this particular presentation, I'm going to go into three parts. I'm going to talk about living systems as cognitive systems, then go on to language, and language as lineages of distinctions, and further, different distinctions, different lineages, and different cultures that we then treat as this reality, this elusive reality. So let's begin with living systems as cognitive systems. A living system, in this iconic image of Maturana's, is represented by the circle that closes in on itself. It's generating itself. It's the process that generates the process that generates the process. It's entirely recursive. This living system, however, cannot exist except in connection with its medium. It has to act and sense. And this is true for however primitive a living system we may look at, from bacteria to horses or plants. Every one of them has this connection. The medium responds in one manner or another, either physically or conceptually, or depending what kind of medium it is. And the living system coordinates its action according to the new sensation it gets from the medium. This is the sensory effector coordination. I used to say sensory motor, but effector is more appropriate because not all of these actions are motor. It could be chemical, for example. So we as an observer looking at this would call this coherent connection cognition. And that is why we say living system or cognitive systems. Another statement Maturana makes is that the nervous system is a detector of configurations within itself. In other words, it's not detecting the world, it is detecting itself, detecting the changes in itself in a way that is entirely coherent with the world. And this means that cognition is a systemic dynamic. It happens systemically within the living system, with its relations with the world, and the world itself too is a systemic phenomenon, much more complex than any linear thing that we could specify. I could say the nervous system is hyperdimensional, or perhaps better, adimensional. In other words, dimensionality as a concept may not even apply. So I kind of think of it as a complex web with little things happening here and there. And in conclusion, I could say what we know is not reality. I should have put that in capital R. Rather, our cognition consists of sensory effector coordinations in a manner that has been and continues to be adequate for our living. And this is where the elephant comes in. If we do think there is an elephant and we act accordingly and that's adequate for our living, well, the elephant may as well be real. But most of the time, it really has to do with our daily life. So these cucumbers and zucchinis from my garden, I don't concern myself whether this is reality or not. I just act appropriately in a way that feels real to me. So I can think of this as cognition being an enabling constraint, enabling in the sense that enables us to be adequately connected and continue living, and a constraint in the sense that it doesn't provide us with everything that there might possibly be. So I would call this systemic cognition. This is the systemic long history of inheritance that we have from the most fundamental living systems on, and we still maintain now. And then we also have thinking and language. And the interesting thing is the systemic cognition comes into our thinking and language, enters into it in some manner or other, and then as we think in language, it again influences our systemic cognition. So let's go on with thinking about language, and language as a lineage of distinctions, which I will cover in the next little section.